We're doing a series where we're talking about the I am statements of Jesus, and there's these 7 things that Jesus says he is, and we're exploring those because really, if you're going to be a Christian and a follower of Jesus, you should really know who Jesus says he is, because there's a lot of things on the internet that, it's funny because people will make posts, well, Jesus stood for this and Jesus stood for that, and I'm like, I don't think you've actually read what Jesus said about himself. And so Christianity, faith is not just a matter of joining a church. It's not just a matter of saying, I believe in something, but it's actually living out and believing and following the things that Jesus taught. And so that's why we teach through Scripture, and that's why, in this case, we're going through these 7 statements as we lead up to Easter, because believe it or not, it's right around the corner. Anyone feel like Christmas just happened, and then you got the flu or something, and next thing you know, we're prepping for Easter, and then that's going to be over. We're going to hit summer vacation, and you're like, finally a little break, but there's no break, because adulting is just a series of, going, it's going to be a little easier next month, and then it's not, and then it's suddenly, we're going to be into the fall, and we'll be at Christmas again. So some of you love that. I know Dana's already counting down. Do you start the day after Christmas? Yes. Anyway, this week we're doing, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. Now, some of your translations may say something like door, same thing, but you get the idea. So if I vary between door and gate, that's just, I'm altering translations, or I'm a little altered and off. We'll blame the cold medicine. So in John chapter 10, it says this. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of the sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And so if you kind of put this in context, because really one of the keys to understanding the Bible, and it can be hard, the first time you read the Bible, there's all kinds of things going on, and there's a context to it. And so Jesus doesn't just walk down the street and start saying this, but it's this continuation of this sort of fight with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, all the religious leaders of the day. And really, it's not just that. There is this history of criticizing the religious leadership. Now, that's great because we can all take a pause here and you can criticize me for a second. No, I'm kidding. But really, oftentimes in Israel's history, the leaders didn't act like they were supposed to. They didn't do the things they were supposed to. And Jesus, his conflict with the Pharisees at the temple doesn't have to do with God's law, but it's like the extra stuff people add on and the odd things they do. And they often create barriers for people for faith that shouldn't be there. So there's this great continuation of things that we see throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. I tend to call it the Hebrew Bible because Old Testament makes it sound like it's not good anymore. It's still good stuff in there, and it was written in Hebrew. So so it's this continuation of this theme of likening also spiritual leadership to caring for sheep. And Jesus is criticizing the spiritual leadership for not doing what they needed to do. Now, 2 weeks ago, I might say last week sometimes because I keep getting, last time I preached because I had to go to a conference, and just with schedules and everything, I had to take a red eye home. So we red eye home, showered, and we were in church because we like church. But I spared you having a sermon after Jeff took a red eye home because that could be really short. And you're like, that was a good sermon, I like that. Or didn't make any sense, but yeah. Or it could be really long because I could be like wandering around till I find my point. And so we were fortunate. Heath kind of came down last week. He still has some freedom to come down. But 2 weeks ago, the last I Am message, we were talking about Jesus heals this blind man. And so this dude is like blind since birth. And it's kind of a crazy story. You have to read it if you haven't, or you can check out the sermon. Jesus spits, makes mud. Like, that's an odd thing. Like, just own that. He rubs it in the dude's eyes. Guy washes it off, and then he can see. And then there's this whole dynamic of he's like, I'm healed, and the Pharisees get mad, and it kind of turns from the amazing fact that he's healed to, they're kind of like going, well, what about the healer? Who's this guy? And, the guy's like, hey, I don't know. didn't see, and now I see. And he ends up getting this conflict with the religious leaders. Kind of crazy. He even gets like kicked out of the synagogue. He gets sort of put, and it's, they're less concerned with the miracle than that it broke a rule they had. And the Pharisees, here's the thing, they knew the law. And it even started, like if you read the history of Phariseeism, which I'm sure all of you sit down all the time and read this, right? You're like, I'm really interested in Second Temple Judaism. But if you read the history, it starts off as a good movement. They're concerned about God's law. They're concerned about, and surely we see this today. People are concerned with things, but then they set up barriers and rules that really weren't the rules, and they kind of miss the intention of it. It's kind of like HOAs. Like, I'm the kind of guy that they start HOAs to get rid of, right? Because I got like a pile of scrap behind the shed, and some of you, I get it. I try to hide it, be nice to me. But then HOAs, if you've ever been in one, they develop some rules where they make it hard to live sometimes. Now, some of you are like, I like the rules of my HOA. Well, that's great. That's you, not me. No HOA in our neighborhood. And some of you are like, that's why we're not moving next to you, Jeff. But you kind of miss the purpose of the law. And some people can get really good about laws, and the Pharisees often did that, but they missed out the point of the fact that it's for people. So they'd be like, you broke the Sabbath. And Jesus is like, hey, the Sabbath is for the people, not the people for the Sabbath. And so there's this constant tension because the Pharisees, they didn't understand the purpose of the law. They loved the law of God, but they didn't love the God of the law. And the God of the law is standing right in front of them. That's Jesus. We believe he was God incarnate. And he's sitting there incarnate in flesh. I always think of carne asada, but which would be really good. He's standing right in front of them, and they're missing it. And when we read in John 8, Jesus said, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. And the Pharisees, there are a lot of things, but they're kind of bright. They're like, hey, are you saying we're blind? And Jesus says, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, but you remain guilty because you claim you can see. And so there's this leadership conflict that's going on, and that extends into this chapter if you read the book. And so back to the text, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of the sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. And now, most of us, when we think about a sheepfold, we don't really have any idea what that is, right? Unless you've studied kind of some history. Like most of us, like the closest we get to sheep is a petting zoo, right? Like anyone been to a petting zoo and you have a sheep? And I remember we were in the one down at there was a petting zoo down at the state fair one time, and this goat was eating my shirt and everything, and that's about I didn't grow up raising animals. Maybe this is southern Delaware, so maybe some of y'all did. But or maybe the state fair barns. That's the closest some of us are going to get to it. But there's sheep there, and so here, helpful background knowledge. The sheep pen was usually it was something like built together with rocks. It'd be like a rock enclosure because, like some of you have chickens and you have to kind of put them in at night because there's birds of prey, all kinds of things. We have lots of foxes where we live. And so you have to do things to protect against predators. I don't have people running over to steal my chickens. I don't even have chickens. But you kind of get and so they would build this little wall, and then sometimes it's a wall, tall enough you'd have to climb over it in this case, and it possibly covered with branches and things to sort of discourage predators, and there'd be like one way in, one way out. And sometimes you'd use a gate or something, but sometimes like someone would just sit there. Now I know this is not going to be a reference that everyone gets, but it reminded me so much of the Husafel stone. Okay, 2 of us get it. If you're a strongman fan, I used to do strongman. I loved lifting heavy things. And the Husafel stone it's a 410-pound stone that Pastor Snorri Bjornsson placed around 1756. And it was the gate to his sheep pen. And, it was a pretty effective gate because not too many people can pick up a 410-pound stone. And there's this tradition that I wanted to do before I tore both my arms off, which is you pick up the stone and you walk around the sheep pen and put it back in its place. And they have some really long Icelandic thing to say, "You're really strong." And that was like kind of one of my goals in life. That would have been like a fun vacation, and I love lifting stones. I don't do it anymore. Now it's like more like small rocks and pebbles because my body's falling apart. You can even buy a replica for strongman and stuff. Anyway, you've learned a little history. I know that it only worked for 2 of us, I think, but 2 of us were really excited about that. Probably only helpful for a couple of us, but you kind of get the point. You block the pen with something, and so a shepherd or guard would sit there, lay in the entrance, and that way a thief couldn't just kind of walk through because they're there, and the sheep stay in because there's someone in the gate, and they're sheep. And I watched all kinds of sheep videos. We watched some after men's Bible study yesterday, and I watched more last night, and I don't know how many. Next week we're going to talk a little more about sheep too, and there's just some hilarious videos that I'll have to include in the YouVersion thing with funny sheep things. And so the purpose is the person sits there to what? Guard the sheep, keep them safe. And so he's there. Now, in my travels, I won't tell you what city because I don't like people picking on particular cities, but we went to a much more urban place than Denise and I are used to, and she tagged along with me, and so, I go to this conference. We ended up, we had a little extra time, so we go downtown, and it was interesting because, you can't always tell on a map where you're going to end up in cities, and I've lived in a lot of cities, and it was very city-like, if you get my drift. And so we swung into this, and I'm not going to name the store either because I don't want people to politicize anything. But I go in this store, and as we step in, there's these 2 armed guards, looks like SWAT. And on the one hand, you're like, what's going on here that they need these guys? And 2 of them, not just 1. But on the other hand, you're like, well, maybe I should feel safe because they're here. And as we're coming in, the manager's saying something. He's talking to the guards, and this homeless dude walks out with a stack of pants. And I can see the tags and everything on them. And I'm waiting for it to go down, you know what I mean? And then the one guard starts to go, and the other's like, no, don't do it. And they just watched them walk out. And all I could think, and I understand there's store policies, there's all kinds of things and the reasons that happen, but I was like, they're not very good guards, right? That's not a good gate. Why do you have a SWAT team at the front if homeless dudes walk out with stacks of pants? And they were neatly stacked too. He wasn't even trying to hide it. That was the funny thing. I know I've known people who steal, they do clever things, and I'm not saying it's good, but it just literally walked out with a stack of pants. It was an odd moment, but not a good gate, right? That's not the purpose, and none of them are good guards, I'd say, although they still have a job, which is crazy to me. And that's really it's kind of like the spiritual leadership of Israel at the time. They looked the part. And it's funny because religious people always have hats for some reason. And that's, kind of picture the Pharisees if you watch any, The Chosen or something. They looked the part, but they weren't really doing the job. They weren't really guarding and being spiritual overseers in the way they should be. And so Jesus says, but the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They'll run from him because they don't know his voice. And so the gatekeeper opens the gate for him. You only let in and out the people who are supposed to be there, right? I've spent a lot of time in prison visiting folks. And, if you've ever, anyone, I'm not going to raise your hand because you may not, but if you've ever visited someone in prison, there's all kinds of paperwork. You have to call between certain times. You have to have IDs on you. You have to leave everything in the car. And so there's this, you have to have the right stuff to come in. Or maybe for some of you like to go to concerts. And you have to have an actual ticket. Now it's something you scan, but it's funny, not funny, but funny, that sometimes you buy a ticket, you got to be careful who you buy it from, right? Because if you don't, you could buy a ticket, it looks real, it scans, and it goes, bang, because that's not a real ticket. You bought a fake. And so the gate workers at the concert, they only let in people with what? The right ticket. And so that's the kind of thing we're picturing here. Most of us don't care for sheep, but maybe you understand the gate has this purpose. And it says they know their voice, they won't follow a stranger. The shepherd would call his sheep, and they knew the voice of the shepherd. And they would know his voice because shepherds, and I always picture kind of shepherds bored out there. This is like, you couldn't like play on your phone while you're watching sheep in those days because the reception was really bad out there. No, but you know, you couldn't like play on that. So they would often sing and talk to their sheep. And if you've ever like, you think that's crazy, but how many of us talk to our dog like it understands everything? You know, like you have full conversations. Anyone have like a song they sing to their dog? Like I do. You know, maybe you're a cat person. You could sing to your cat. I don't know. Do cats like singing? I don't know. But you know, and you'd often like they would get to know your voice. And it's kind of like a dog because I don't know that my dog understands much of what I say, but there's certain things that like she'll respond accordingly because she knows I'm telling her to do something, and she's probably going to get a treat. Less likely a treat from me, more likely a treat from one of the kids or my wife. But, you know, they do certain things. There's this trained behavior. And a well-trained dog will come to you when you call him. Mine, not so much. I don't know if she's deaf or just doesn't want to come. She's such a great dog in so many ways, but not in that one. You know, and the dog will come, you know, because they know your voice. And often, you know, I've had dogs that will come when I call it, but not when someone else calls it, right? Because it knows my voice. It's not just the name. It knows, hey, you know, especially my dog Chewy was like the perfect dog. And like if I said, Chewy, because that's how I called him, because it sounds like a pig call, you know, he would come. Because he knew, hey, that's Jeff. That's my, you know, anyway. And so really modern shepherds today, it's kind of interesting because you can kind of extrapolate back because some of the customs on things like sheep herding are passed down generation to generation. But modern shepherds can actually separate a big flock of sheep can get pushed together, and they do their own calls, and most of the sheep will end up following and separating because they know the voice of their shepherd. And there's this trust that goes with that. And so the verse 6 says, those who heard Jesus use this illustration didn't understand what he meant. Now, that's a fairly common thing. I mean, it seems kind of straightforward, but, you know, they're kind of, people are like, I don't get it. And so Jesus kind of, you know, gives them this metaphor to help them understand. He says in verse 7, so he explained to them, I tell you the truth. Here we go. I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate. Those who come in through me will be saved. They will come and go freely and will find good pastures. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. So Jesus is the gate. Now, those of you who, I don't know, it's still southern Delaware, so you live on farms. Last couple of years, I just haven't had time to hunt, which I really enjoy being out there. But usually with the kids, I would drive up to the farm, and, you know, when they were younger, they didn't have to, but as they got older, you know, I'd pull up to the farm, and there was a gate across there because we had trouble because people were living in the barn and stealing stuff and all kinds of things. So we had to put a gate on the farm I hunt and, you know, pull up to the gate and you know, Josh would have to jump out and, you know, get the code and get the gate off and unhook it and drive. And then I'd drive through, you know, and so the gate, it keeps us from where we want to go. It also keeps other people out. And really there's this opening gate that an open gate lets you go where you want to go. And when you trust God as the Savior, the gate opens, right? It's this new way of life, this new way of living, and it's a spiritually open gate. It's not physical, but spiritual. You know, Jesus is the gate. Now, Pharisees, they were sort of the gatekeepers of the temple. If you will, the Sadducees were the gatekeepers of the temple. They kind of had, you know, in charge of that. This was hereditary. They were kind of a group of people. They were sort of the gatekeepers there. And the Pharisees were really the Judaism of the day. It's where we get rabbinic Judaism, and it's this. They were the keepers of that. You know, they kind of decided who's in, who's out. And the Pharisees kicked the blind man out of the synagogue. Therefore, they're the gatekeepers of that. And Jesus, though, is the true door. He is the true gate. So the Pharisees, to paraphrase, is like, hey, we decide. We're the gate. We're the keepers. And Jesus is like, nah, I'm the real door. You're missing the point. Jesus is the gate. The gate allows the sheep in or out. The gate protects the sheep. And ultimately, there's only one gate. It's not controversial to say. In most contexts, there are some places in the world we got to be careful, and but in America, you can kind of say Jesus is the door to God, and people will be like, amen, yeah, that's great. Here, where it gets controversial, but true, is Jesus is the door to God. Because generally, people don't like exclusivity. But Jesus was very clear about what he believed, what he came for, what he did. And we may kind of make Jesus out to be one way, and that's another, I'm jumping ahead, one door, one gate, but he is the gate. He's the way to God. And, big question for disciples, Pharisees, people of today, and really for us too, is, who is Jesus? And C.S. Lewis popularized the trilemma, lunatic, liar, or Lord. So Jesus was either crazy and deranged, said some stuff that, like we all have that cousin who says some things that you're just like, I don't know. And if you don't have that cousin, you might be that cousin, I'm just saying. But, or we've all known someone who maybe lies and says some stuff. We've seen charlatan preachers and things, and there's that guy at work you have that kind of makes up all kind of stuff, gets credit for everything. You have just people liar, or Jesus is who he says he is. And really, it comes down to a faith decision. You have to decide, is Jesus lunatic, liar, or is he Lord? Jesus is much more clear about who he is than our culture often realizes, largely because people like the idea of Jesus, but they don't read the book. And Jesus says some very clear things. Jesus is the gate. The reality is there's two doors. There's a door to life and a door to death. And Jesus is the door to life. He's not one of many doors. There's lots of other gates, but they don't all lead to the same place, right? You picture your street right now. I kind of like turn in your mind like Google Street View, I love Google Street View. When you're going somewhere you don't know where, you're like trying to figure out, is there street parking in this crazy place I'm going? Or should I learn the public transportation? I usually learn the public transportation. But, it's, kind of Google Street View in your mind for a second, and you picture your neighborhood. There's lots of front doors you can go into, right? But only one brings you home. And ultimately, Jesus wants us to come home. He wants us to have this relationship with us. He wants us to come into this relationship with him. Now, occasionally, I will quote John 10:10. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. You have to be aware of thieves because some will come and take. Kind of like the fake tickets and the scalpers online. People will hand out something they say is true, but it's not. They may even believe it's true. You could buy a ticket that someone bought from someone that they thought was real. I remember one time I brought a coupon to this establishment, and I printed it off the internet, and turns out it was a fake coupon that someone created with Photoshop and was sending around online. And I felt kind of dumb, but there was no obligation for that store, and they didn't think I was trying to pull something, but it still doesn't work, right? Like free latte. Nope. No latte. You want a lot of latte, you got to pay a little money. And so there's this fault, and it won't get you in the gate. Scalpers aren't out for your own good, they're out for their own good. And there's always going to be people in life who peddle religious stuff to you because they get something out of it. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. I think a lot of times people who aren't people of faith kind of see faith as restrictive. That was a conversation we had again. Men's Bible study is like I'm testing out ideas that are going to make the sermon or not, so they're like the rough draft. But we were having this discussion yesterday because of a book we're reading together. Not the Bible. I mean, we do read the Bible, but it's this other book with Eugene Peterson, good dude. But non-Christians, most see the faith as restrictive, right? Like, think if you're a believer and you're a follower of Jesus, think of a friend, they would think of faith and they think of a bunch of rules, right? And there are, like, in honesty, in all fairness, there are rules to faith. Like, it's not like a free-for-all. Jesus gives us freedom, but there are a set of rules and ways of living. And I think of, the expression I heard when I was younger. It's like, don't smoke or chew or go with girls who do. I don't know very many girls who, like, chew, but hey, we're not from some of the southern states. We're almost a southern state. People don't know where Delaware is. Like, I find myself, I was at Johns Hopkins this week, and I'm like, Delaware's it's not as far as you think. Like, we're just a couple hours over. And people think we're in, like, New England, or people think we're in the South. Some people think we're in Texas. I'm like, I know. I'm like, I don't know. I couldn't name all 50 states for you. I get the first part because that song, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, and then that's it. But I don't remember the rest of the song. I should probably sing it, so I do. I can't name them, but if you kind of like said state, yes or no, I could get it. And for some reason, people like Delaware, they're like, I don't think that's a state. That's like a county. Like, isn't that a city somewhere? Anyway. Don't smoke or chew or go girls do. I got off on a tangent there. And a lot of people think of faith as like stop having fun, right? Like surely you know someone who's like this, and and I kind of thought it was that way before I became a believer. And here's the God gave us lots of rules. They think God gave us lots of rules and a life to be miserable and happy, and many Christians give them every indication that that's true. Right? There's some miserable people of faith, if we can be honest. Like, they're not the best, examples of things. I've used the example, some Christians act like they were baptized in vinegar. Like, I don't know where that was originally said. I'm not sure the source. But there's some people that are no fun, no laughter. I've had people criticize me because I make jokes during the sermon. I'm like, I think if you read more carefully, you'd see some jokes even in what Jesus is saying. He's using hyperbole and stuff. It's, you can not laugh at my dad jokes, but they're funny, and it's okay. They're really punny. But it's not a sin to laugh, right? There is this joy to faith because we're living in the way God has called us to live. And Psalm 51, this is like a psalm after, David had sinned. He gets confronted by the prophet. It's like this awkward moment, and he writes this psalm. And it says, in verse 11, do not banish me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. He doesn't want to be pushed out of God's presence because sin separates us from God. But again, God is always this redeeming God. It's by grace that, he has faith, and it's kind of before Jesus shows up on the scene, but God's kind of preemptively doing some things. And ultimately, God doesn't come to condemn, but to offer restoration. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. There is this joy in faith. And it doesn't mean, that everything's always good, but, there's this joy to the way we live life because of faith. One commentator said this. I love this. It says, many think that the way to joy or a good time is by sinning. They think that godliness is dull. Actually, the opposite is the case. Sin brings sorrow. Righteousness brings rejoicing. Allowed to continue, sin will remove every good thing from our lives. Joy, health, wealth, and at last, even life itself. And there's a lot of things we pursue because we think they're going to be fun. And it's fun at first. Because if it wasn't, we wouldn't keep doing it. But ultimately, a lot of those things are not good for us long term. I always likened sin as like a little baby lion cub. I'll have to admit, until the pandemic, I didn't know you could own a tiger. I always wanted to own one. I didn't watch the whole series. It was too much for me. And then we had a tornado, so I spent most of my time rebuilding my house from a tornado. And so that was God's way of keeping me out of the stupid TV shows that ruled the pandemic. But, eventually it grows up and eats you, right? But that's a lot of times how sin is. And, there's this joy in following Jesus, but not that everything's easy. Now, this week, I got that little light that popped into my car. Not the one that I covered over with black tape, because Everyone's got that one, like the TPS sensors. You're like, yeah, I'm not doing those right now. So you just a little electrical tape, it covers over that, and it's not a problem anymore. You just make sure you check your tires regularly if you do that. Some people are like right now writing me a letter in their head. But the oil change light comes on, and I have a decision to make. Because I have to do these day trips sometimes to places for meetings and things, and so I got to put some miles on the car. I got to pick someone up at an airport this week, and I can decide I can either do another car but I need to either get the oil changed somewhere, or I'm more likely to do it myself. I got to put it on the calendar and I got to do it, or I could just reset the light with the computer I have and act like it never happened. Which of those is the best option? Short term, reset the light, good to go. I got some time back in my day. Long term, I'm going to need a new engine. and that's God's stuff is this long-term better way of living. And in a moment, sometimes there's some sadness because you have to spend some time and effort in a way you may not want to. But it is this better way of life, this better way of living. And God's the manufacturer, if you will, of us, and so he knows the right things to do. He knows when the oil should be changed, and we have to decide, are we going to change it or ignore it? And Jesus comes and he gives us this new way of life. And again, this is a summary of the things Jesus teaches. When he asked what the greatest commandment, Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is equally important. Love your neighbors yourself. The entire law and the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. We paraphrase that, love God, love others. And that's, again, it's a better way of life. It's a better way of living. It'll bring you joy. And that covers a lot of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible commandments. I think there's 633, if I remember. There's a lot of commandments, but a lot of them are getting people to not be jerks to one another. It's limiting the way they can be jerks to one another. It covers the 10 commandments. Because if you love God, you'll honor him. If you love others, you won't steal from them. For example. And so there's just a better way of living. And then Matthew records the Sermon on the Mount. It's really this compact summary of Jesus' teachings. If you ever, and I know I've been saying this almost every week, because I think so much about what it means to live as a person of faith in a very divided and controversial world, read the Sermon on the Mount. Because when we Jesus is like, hey, don't just hear this stuff, do this stuff, right after preaching that. And there's all these ways that we're supposed to live in a world, that's very confusing at times, that's challenging, a world that often calls us to live in a way that's different than Jesus calls us to live. But there's this better way of life, this better way of living. And if you're not sure about that, hit me up. We'll sit down, we'll go through it, we'll have coffee. It'll be good. And I'll even buy the coffee, first round. You buy the second round. No. I'll make coffee if we have to. His rules liberate us to live the life we're meant to live. And hard things still come our way, but we know he's going to work things out. Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work for good of those who love God, are called according to his purpose for him. And hard things, God still works. Last week, Heath shared this example, which was hilarious to me because a couple people and I were talking just before that about trees they bought, and they were gonna plant some trees, and then I was talking about, I had these 2 apple trees as a kid that, my aunt has a farm that had apple trees until recently. With global climate change, they cut the trees out and they're doing other farming, but we had these 2 apple trees that we got from when they were planting trees, and I think they got wiped out by the tornado, but you really they have to be pruned back hard if you really want to grow apples. And so my mom she liked the way the trees looked, so she didn't cut them back hard. But really, to get the fruit, you just have to cut them down to stumps every year. And they come back and they produce fruit. And I don't understand it all. I'm not an apple farmer. But there's a lot of cutting that goes on. And the trauma, I guess, creates good fruit. And Heath was sharing a story when he was living in Indonesia, and the weather is difficult outside for those of us who are human. It's like hot and sweaty, and but he had a mango tree in the front yard, and the bad weather created really good mangoes. And you kind of picture that. And often the good fruit in our lives is produced by hard things we go through. So, but here's the thing, even in the midst of that, you can have joy. It doesn't mean every little bit of your life is easy, But there's joy in faith. And I did a funeral this week, and I almost always read Psalm 23 because it's like a comforting one. It's crazy to me. It was written like 3,000 years ago in another language, but most people still find it comforting today. There's one line I like in Psalm 23, verse 4. It says, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me." And I might read the whole thing next week because we're going to talk about Jesus as a shepherd. But it doesn't say God will keep me from bad stuff, right? It talks about the darkest valley, and I know our King James folks, the valley of the shadow of death. Man, that hits a little harder. I do like that translation because the truth is we go through hard things in life, but there's still joy. Because when you have faith and you trust God, you can trust that God's going to work out beautiful things, and it doesn't cause all the bad. God's not to blame for everything. We do enough on our own. we do enough to each other on our own. But God will still use all those things to develop fruit and character and bring good things out of it. And ultimately, 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Stay alert, watch out for the great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." We have this real enemy prowling around like a lion. And ultimately, though, Jesus is our protection. He's the gate. He's going to protect us. And ultimately, there's hope in this world, not in this world, but in the next. And because ultimately, eventually, we're all going to be judged by what we do. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10 says, "For we all must stand before Christ to be judged. We'll have each receive whatever we deserve for the good or evil we have done in this earthly body." Eventually, all this wraps up. I was a lifeguard for a long time, and so I picture, everybody out of the pool. We're closing. You may not know when it's coming. You kind of guess at the timing. But ultimately, there is this moment where it wraps up, and believers will be rewarded for their work. Paul describes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where he says, "Anyone who builds on the foundation may use a variety of materials, gold, silver, jewels, wood, hay, or straw. But on the judgment day, fire will reveal what kind of work each builder has done. The fire will show if a person's work has any value. If the work survives, the builder will receive a reward. But if the work is burned up, the builder will suffer great loss. The builder will be saved, but someone barely escaping through a wall of flames." And so if you're in Christ, your security is there. You'll have eternal life, but there is a reward for the way we live our life now. And we should live in a way that honors God. And not just for the reward, but because it's, again, the right way to live. And so, although it's not popular to talk about judgment and hell, there is judgment. We often joke about the "only God can judge" tattoo. And there was like a meme or like a little video a while back, and it was like, that's worse, right? Because God's judgment is correct. I will give you a pass on a lot of stuff, man. I'm like, yeah, I get it, man. I'm probably your better judge because I'm just I know my own stuff. But it's true, but serious. Only God can judge. When we live our life knowing there's a final exam, it should be comforting because we don't have to worry about what others think about our lives. We should be concerned just about what Jesus thinks about our lives. Jesus is the gate. And it's interesting because it's the same word is used for the door or gate in Matthew 25. And this is like a story. I think it's been a while since we talked about this one. Matthew 25. Now I'm going to read from the Message translation because we've been reading Eugene Peterson. He translated the Message, and the Message is it's a paraphrase of the Greek, but sometimes he tells things. He does some really great translation work. There's you guys know I like Eugene. And he says this, he says, "God's kingdom is like 10 young virgins who took oil lamps and went out to greet the bridegroom. 5 were silly and 5 were smart." I like that, the silly ones. The silly virgins, took lamps but no extra oil. The smart ones took jars of oil to feed their lamps. The bridegroom didn't show up when they expected him. They all fell asleep. And that's kind of like the end of time. We kind of think, like everyone's like predicting when Jesus is coming back. I remember I was interviewed by the paper one time. They're like, what do you think about this date? I'm like, just the fact that we got that date in mind, it's probably not going to happen. I can almost guarantee you. And I remember I got interviewed for one, and I was like, and we'll be having services the next day because Jesus was coming back on Saturday. Now, if Jesus came back and I guess I got left, they would say, anyway. Because we don't know when. In the middle of the night, someone yelled, he's here, the bridegroom here, go out and greet him. And the 10 virgins got up and got their lamps ready. The silly virgin said, our lamps are going out, lend us some of your oil. And they're like, hey, there may not be enough to go around, go buy. So they did. But while they were out buying the oil, the bridegroom arrived, was there to greet him, had gone into the wedding feast, and the gate was locked. And then there's this, much later the other ones show up. They're like, hey, let us in. And he answers, do I know you? I don't think I know you. This is like a tradition where people would follow the bridegroom down the street. And there's, and Jesus is using it to make a point that, hey, there's a time-limited offer on this. We were talking earlier. I'm like, when you're sick and everything, and then I've been sick a lot this year. I'm not scared of death, but I'm not like hoping I die tomorrow. You know what I mean? I like life. I enjoy living life. I love my kids. It's been a privilege to see them grow up to the age they are. I hope I get to see them grow up. I hope I get to have grandkids someday. I'm officially at the age where I'm thinking about grandkids. But here's the thing, it is this time-limited offer because we have to be prepared because you never know when you're going to go. I heard a comedian say, he was talking about being in his 50s, it's like the drop-dead time. I'm like, yeah, it happens. You never know. My dad's been blessed with a good long life, but, you never know. We don't. You have a car accident today. I hope you don't. Enjoy hanging out. But there is this open door invitation, if you will, but it eventually closes. The door's locked. And Jesus is the gate. And to make no decision about following Jesus is making a decision not to enter that gate. And here, kind of thoughts on the whole message is learn to listen to his voice. The sheep hear his voice, and you learn to recognize his voice. The world wants to drown it out, right? There's all kinds of things going on. And, the lack of silence in our world, I find myself on my phone all the time. Anyone else? You didn't even mean to be on your phone. I sent a quick message, and next thing you know, I'm scrolling through Facebook feeds and Twitter and Instagram. You're on Insta whatever, you're on. It's not. And there's all kinds of sounds and things coming at you. It's like there's TikTok videos playing all the time. It's hard to be, just quiet. It has to be intentional to take quiet time, right? And so there's all these things that kind of, I think, drown out things. God's speaking, but there are many times when we don't hear, but God's still speaking. And we have to take time to listen to his voice because he calls us. He calls us to salvation. He calls us to live this new way of life. And, and he speaks to our hearts. God will speak to you directly. No, probably not in an audible voice. Like if God spoke in an audible voice, I would die, and then you have to raise the dead. But he speak. And then you confirm that by, that's why we read the Bible. Because the Bible says some pretty cool stuff, and there's something transformative about learning to immerse yourself in his word, and you'll hear that. And then ultimately through Christian community. I think that's why sometimes community is so important. And I think community is, and church body and connection. And for me, I often say, church is not what we do. The church is the people. And people are always like, where's your church? And I'm like, well, they're probably most at work right now. And they're like, no, what I mean is where's the building? Oh, the church meets at, this place. But that's not the church. And the community does so much to shape us, But, it was funny. I was talking to someone the other day. We were talking about how much community shapes you. And, I used this before, but, the Bible says iron sharpens iron. But, it comes with a lot of sparks. Because when you're really in community with people, it can be awkward. It can be difficult. There can be times where you're frustrated, but that's community. But it shapes us. But here's the thing. God will speak to you through community. I think some of the biggest growth points in my life have been when my wife said something to me that hurt, right? Because it was true. And then, but it takes that relationship often for God to speak truth into your life. We tend to, in America, if someone offends us in a church, we just go to another one. And you can just go to another one. And then eventually you can cycle back unless you're in a really small town, You just keep cycling enough. But ultimately community should shape us, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. We often talk about the ABCs of salvation. Number one is, admit you're a sinner and have made mistakes. And we have. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We naturally kind of mess up. But we don't live there. That's not our identity. Because, if we believe that, Jesus is God's only son and he chose to die on a cross for us. And that's what we celebrate here at Easter. Is, he pays the price for our sin so that we can have a relationship with him. And I think American Christian or American church people, they kind of do the A and the B. But it's the C that I think is the clincher. C for clincher. But it's the hard one. It's commit. Commit to a life of following Jesus. And that means dying to yourself. It means, doing what he would have you to do. It means serving others. It means being in community. It means a lot of things. But following Jesus is core. Because the sheep hear his voice. They come in and they're saved. And it's something as simple as just praying, God, I know I've sinned against you. I believe Jesus came and died on a cross for me. I commit my life to following you from this day forward. And if you pray that kind of prayer, come to me, talk to me. If you're online, connect with us online. Would love to talk to you about faith.